So this is a complex area of work. And I'm sure you would agree that education generally is a complex area of work. But I think to try to promote social cohesion in education is particularly challenging. And it's a challenge that I think we have tried as a country to confront since 1994. As you know, South Africa in 1994, and sometimes I think it's important to remind ourselves that we had a negotiated settlement in 1994. There were certain trade-offs that we made. There were certain decisions that I think if we had a different resolution to the conflict of apartheid, I think we might have had a different settlement. And I think it's important sometimes to remind ourselves of what the impact of some of those decisions were on education. So when Yusuf and the team argue in the report that, that we've got a bifurcated or two-tier system of education, that's directly linked to some of the choices that we made as a state and as a society. Of course, because of the post-conflict settlement that we've had to try to manage that transition in a particular way. As government, of course, to us from the word go, it was important to build a united, democratic South Africa. And we had this particular focus on nation building, social cohesion, on us, across the system, beginning to open up education and break down the 19 different education departments that we've had. The challenges that we've had in those schools, and for a lot of black children in rural, township schools, those challenges haven't necessarily gone away. We recognized as the Department of Education that teachers, of course, must play and do play a central role in terms of what happens in schools. And no matter what kind of policy context you create, what happens in schools is essentially mediated by teachers. And if teachers, in terms of our own history, where they come from, if teachers struggle to teach, were poorly qualified, poorly trained, that those teachers would necessarily struggle in schools. In the post-1994 period, and there's a lot of people in this room today that have walked some of this distance with us. In the post-1994 period, there was a lot of support for this kind of work. We supported NGOs, we were very generous with our funding. There were lots of civil society activity within our schools. We encouraged teachers to go on training courses. We provided lots of funding to various universities to offer a range of courses, from advanced certificates to specific short courses and so on. There was lots of money available for this area of work. And around 2005, 2006, after Professor Kader Asma left, who refused to allow us to participate in international tests, we then got the shock of our lives. Because in every single international test that we participated in, we ended up right at the bottom. Our kids couldn't read, couldn't write, they couldn't do basic maths and science, and so immediately within government there was that reaction to that. And so the policy space for the work that we generally do in terms of social cohesion, anti-racism, anti-discrimination, anti-sexism, that policy space shut down very, very quickly. In fact, it was brutal on a lot of NGOs because a lot of NGOs were simply pushed out of business because the government funding just dried up, almost overnight. And a lot of colleagues that have persisted because they've had to work really, really hard to fundraise, to get the money, and to do this kind of work. In the department, everything shifted towards the STEM subjects. I mean, even today when you hear our minister speak, You hear our deputy minister speak. It's all about, what are we doing to ensure that we reach the levels in terms of math, science, technology, and so on. And I'm sure you're aware within the department, there's a big push, for example, to digital and online learning, and money is often redirected from teacher development initiatives or the more soft skills work that some of us are involved in to maths and science. And my big question then is, can you blame us if that's the decision that we make? You want children at the end of grade 12 to actually emerge with strong skills, basic skills in reading, writing that allows them to go on to university and proceed to get good jobs. And you also want South Africa as a society to be able to compete internationally. And so as parents, often when I think about these things, we think that those things are important. Now, when we had the first round, Yusuf, and I think, to answer your question, I think this came at the right time. When we had that first round of xenophobic attacks, and I'm sure you'll remember them, those horrific images splashed across our TV screens with immigrants being chased down the road or being burnt alive, shot at, hacked, and so on. In government, suddenly, there was this reaction about, what are we doing? We are doing something wrong. Something has gone wrong here. Because this is the rainbow nation, right? This is the rainbow nation we're talking about. And something has gone wrong. So suddenly, we then got the call to say, what are you doing? What are you doing in terms of social cohesion? When the second round of xenophobic attacks happened, it was even worse. Because we could reflect on what it is that we did, in that first round. And it was as if in between those two periods we'd done very little. And in the Department of Education, suddenly there was a discussion around what else can we do? What are we not doing right? In fact, when we had some of these incidents around, the protest about, and I know you've had some in the Western Cape, and I know, Stan, you've been involved with some of them. When we've had Sansusi, for example, or we had Pretoria Girls High, we were trying to find people to go in and work with the schools, people that are independent, that are outside of government, civil society, and we struggled to find good people. And part of that was because we had demobilized that sector, right? And we've demobilized the civil society sector also, politically, I think. And some of those things will come back to haunt us, I think, going forward. So now that we were given the space, the ministers are coming and saying, we want you to tell us what we can do in terms of education. And it's around about the same time that Yusuf, approached us and said, this is what we want to do. I want to talk briefly about some, unfortunately, I couldn't read the 480-odd page document, but I did manage to read the summary. And I want to make a few points, because for me in the Department of Basic Education, as somebody who is responsible nationally for the promotion of social cohesion in the system, there's a couple of things that I think we need to think through very carefully. And I'm hoping that today will grant us the opportunity to do that. And the first question that I want to pose, and hopefully we'll all reflect on going forward, is the one that Yusuf started, which is, what next? So what do we do after this? Because my responsibility is to not only understand the nature of the challenge, the nature of the problem, but to in fact begin to think through what next? What should I do as the person sitting in the national department? What should I tell my provinces? And what do you expect districts to do, and what should happen in schools? we made a conscious decision in '94 that we needed to improve the training of teachers. And we've done a lot of things in the interim to try to do that. We have been able, over the last 5-6 years in particular, to massively improve the number of teachers we produce, the number of graduate teachers we produce, right? Because we made the decision to close our teacher training colleges. And I know that there's lots of debate and discussions about whether that was a good or a bad thing. We currently produce almost 20,000 teachers a year, graduate teachers, right? That comes out of the system. We have, at the moment, almost 120,000 teachers in training. One of the challenges that we have in the country is that about 50% of all teachers that we train are trained at UNISA. So they get distance education, right? In fact, it's called distance education because it's not online learning or anything like that. You get something in the mail and you do it and you attend lessons and so on. And the quality of teaching at UNISA is particularly poor. And I'll come back to this point because I think it's important for what it is that we're talking about today. We've also done quite a bit since '94 to deal particularly with this issue of under and unqualified teachers in the system. And as Yusuf has explained, Yusuf and the team have explained in the report, we've done quite a bit of work around how you distribute the pool of teachers that you have access to. At the moment, we have about 5,500 unqualified teachers in the system, or underqualified teachers, of the nearly 440,000 teachers that we have in the system. A lot of those teachers, unfortunately, are in the poorer provinces, including the Eastern Cape, which is one of the provinces that the team looked at. And that in itself is a major problem, in terms of how we work. The other challenge that I think one has to think through is if you have 440,000 teachers in the system, and you know that the modalities that we're using currently to train those teachers are inadequate, what are the kinds of things that we need to do with the teachers that are already in the system? Because it's one thing to focus on initial teacher education. And I think we've got a lot more leeway in terms of what happens in terms of initial teacher education. Let me talk a little bit about initial teacher education before I want to return to CPTD. In terms of initial teacher education, we currently give about 1.3 billion rand a year to 23 of the 25 public universities that we have to train our teachers. Right? 1.3 billion rand a year. We target at the moment almost 15,000 students a year. And those 15,000 students are across the system, 1 to 4, right? But at the moment, as the national department or as government, we have no control about how that money gets spent. So the university will come to us and say, our fees for the year, full cost of study, as you know, with all the NSFAS protests that we've had, full cost of study, you get 58,000 or 60,000 rand a year as a student. But in terms of what happens at universities, in terms of what they actually do, we don't influence that at the moment. There's lots of, and I know the report talks about the 7 competencies and standards, of teachers that student teachers need to be trained in. But should we, and this is a theme that I think runs through the report for me at least, but should we, as the national department, should we better control what happens at university? Should we go to universities and say, actually, these are the things that we want you to do as part of your initial teacher training courses? Is that what we should do? Because on the one hand, there seems to be support for that, right? And on the other hand, we're saying, okay, maybe we're being too prescriptive around the caps and about the scripted lesson plans and things that we've put into the system. The big issue for me is how do we find that balance? Because when you have poor teachers, your learning outcomes of children are going to be poor, right? When you have teachers that struggle to pass the grade 6 test when they the grade 6 teachers, for TIMS, for example, or in SACMEC, when they struggle to pass, what do you think will happen to, to children? And so as a national department, should we not script a bit more? And I mean, I'm hoping that this is one of the things that we'll think about. The other complex matter linked to that question of central versus decentralized is around the role of school governing bodies. Because we've created school governing bodies, we kind of based it loosely on the PTSAs of the 80s, right? You remember the parent, teacher, student associations that we had, and we worked really hard to build those in schools so that parents could take ownership for schools. The problem that we have currently is that a lot of the school governing body associations, or a lot of the school governing bodies in poorer schools, poorer communities, really struggle to function. And often in those schools, principals become proxies for the SGB. You struggle to get a quorum to host a meeting. The only time the parent component shows up is when there's an interview or that there's got to be some decision about what to buy for the school. So that you have on the one side, ineffective, inefficient, often non-functional school governing bodies. On the other hand, in your quintile 4 and 5 schools, which is essentially your ex-model C schools, you have school governing bodies that are really efficient and effective, and they manage those schools, they govern them. But they often govern them in terms of their own understanding of what constitutes the world. And often they do so in terms of protecting what they perceive to be the culture of those schools. I was having this discussion with Dylan this morning, who has done a lot of work with us over many, many years in a wide range of schools. But schools actively resist transformation. And SGBs are the custodians of that resistance to transformation. And I'll give you some examples. One of the schools that we spoke about this morning that have taken in, and by the way, I should also say this, SGBs do not oppose opening the school up to learners of color. I have never found that there's a few cases like Ermelo High School, about the language thing. But generally, schools are very open to accepting in learners of color. The problem is teachers of color. And people leave school in droves, white parents in particular, when you employ a teacher of color, because you can't be good enough. But there's other more subtle ways in which this plays itself out. I'm aware, I'm often called about schools that would have opened the learner population, they suddenly 60% black learner in terms of learner numbers, but they would refuse, for example, to offer football as a sport because they say it would impact on their standards and the quality of education that they provide. It's basic ways in which you limit the extent to which you transform. Now, I just want to make this point almost as an aside. In the education department, after '94, we've had several initiatives to try to address issues of social cohesion. And one of the key mistakes I think that we have made, if I sit back now as somebody who was involved then as a junior official in some of those initiatives, is that we assumed that social cohesion was ultimately about race. And again, I think it's something we've got to think about. So and to be fair, I shouldn't say the report, I should say the executive summary. When the executive summary talks about the other who is not present, I think that's a mistake. Because in our schools, in black schools in particular, this sense that somehow black schools are homogeneous is a mistake. So when, for example, a young transgender student that goes to a rural school in Limpopo and who feels that she wants to be allowed to use the bathroom for girls, and the principal says no because you're a boy. That's about othering. And in how we react to it, the systems that we put in place, our conception of social cohesion and how we deal with those kinds of issues must be similar. And that's something I think we need to reflect on as well. I want to return to this, to CPTD, because that for us is a real challenge. And I must admit, I don't have the answers in terms of what it is that we need to do. How do we proceed if we have teachers in the system who have been in the system for many years and who are absolutely convinced that their way of doing things necessarily is the right one? I was at a discussion, in fact, I did a television interview. In fact, it'll be, I think, on Carte Blanche this weekend, and it's a horrible, horrible, horrible interview. But the interview is about corporal punishment, and so, of course, they come with all sorts of clips to me and all sorts of cases that I know nothing about, and so on and so on. But the big thing about corporal punishment, it's a bit like the work that we do in terms of social cohesion. A lot of people in South Africa, not just teachers, a lot of citizens, probably, if in my estimate, probably the majority of people living in our country, absolutely believe that you need to beat a child to discipline them. And I would guess by far the majority. And so when you talk to teachers, which I do often, about corporal punishment, they say, but I grew up like that, I'm fine. In fact, the person that interviewed me for this Carte Blanche interview, when we were done, you know how Carte Blanche gets you to walk out with the person who's interviewing you. He said to me, you know, I was beaten all the time, and I'm fine. So there's a lot of work that I think for social cohesion that we need to think through about that work. We need to think through much more practically what it is that we need to do. And I want to link this to the role of universities. And I'm nearly done, so I'm sorry that I'm taking so long. I want to link this to the role of universities. You know, I think that we need to have this one as a very open discussion. And I'm sure that some of you are working at universities. Universities in South Africa do not play their role. And I want to be very upfront. Because you see, social cohesion is the problem of government. Universities cannot divorce themselves from the realities of the context within which we live. All of us live. And so universities must begin to play a more active role. I think, Yusuf, I think that in many ways, this particular project almost creates the kind of best practice model for me in terms of how we need to work together. And we need to do more of this kind of work. There's an intractable problem that we're sitting with in government. Actually, I'm sitting there and I'm struggling to think through things. I get pulled from pillar to post about 10 million other things and don't have the kind of time that you should have at university to focus, look at these issues, research them, discuss them, bring us together like you've done today to talk further about these big, big challenges that we confront as a society. And universities, unfortunately, are not currently playing your role in this regard. There's various initiatives that we've tried as government over the last few years, partly, and Yusuf is right, partly that almost happened as side products, if you like, of the work that we started in this area, where universities have come forward and said, look, we noticed that these are some of the issues that you are struggling with, and we want to come and work with you. Life orientation, the subject life orientation, which we, at least I, accept as the carrier subject for values and social cohesion. And I think it's important that we have a carrier subject for this area of work. But of all the 23 universities in our country, how many are still training life orientation teachers? Only 2. In fact, universities waited for the O'Connell report on the quality of the National Senior Certificate. And the minute that report was released, which is not the department's response to the report, it is the task team's report, they all started closing down life orientation training. All of them. In fact, I think at WITS, and if there's somebody from WITS, he'll correct me. At WITS, they decided last year that they'll finish the pipeline students. There's no new intake. Only Pretoria and the Northwest University are still training life orientation teachers. And UCT. And it's good to hear that. It's good to hear that, and we'll come back. We must engage universities in terms of the training of life orientation teachers. We currently have a working group that is led by UKZN, and we've got a young black dean who's just been appointed, Thabo, who is leading, in terms of this work. And what we're doing is to look at a foundational course that we want to convince all universities to offer. And one of the discussions I'm having with the minister at the moment is to say, maybe what we must do if universities are reluctant is to use our funding, both through the block grant, which is what comes through DHET, but also we need to look at utilizing Funza Lushaka a lot better. But that's the one part of the issue. The one is that you want universities to actually engage in the kind of work that we want them to do. But the problem that's linked to that is that we sometimes forget is that university lecturers come out of exactly the same system that our teachers come from. And our universities often resist in exactly the same way that our teachers resist. And so what do we need to do working with university lecturers? There's work here that needs to be done. Because it's no good, and I think in the first report, in one of the case studies, I think it was in terms of CPUT, it was on, it's a CPUT course. The report shows exactly that. How universities often resist in exactly the same way that you find teachers resist in schools. And so that's work that I think we need to do as well. And it's difficult when I don't know who's in the audience because I don't know what you'll say. But I'm astounded at when we get criticized or I engage with civil society organizations, they'll often say to me, when it comes to discipline, you've got to have alternative forms of discipline for teachers. And when I engage with universities, I ask them, so what is it that you're teaching? And I have not seen a credible course yet in South Africa. Why is that? My point here is not to be necessarily unfair. I'm trying to be a little bit unfair. But to say to you that our universities must play a bigger role in terms of the key challenges that confront us as South Africa. And as government, we are open to work with you. We are open to support the work that you want to do if that work benefits what it is that we can achieve as a society. And that's why I am so pleased about this particular research project. I'm so pleased because for the first time in a long time, in my experience as a senior official in the national department, we're working very closely with the university on issues that confront us. Often those research agendas are determined for us by some professor sitting in an office or some international donor agency sitting in Washington. And that's what we need to begin to change. These issues are issues that confront all of us, and we've got to do that collectively. In conclusion, Program Director, this issue of policy fuzziness, I just want to return to one last time. Because this, for me, is at the heart of what it is that we do going forward. As government, as a state, we do not want to interfere in schools that work. In fact, our decision often is that where it works, you leave it alone. But unfortunately, because that is our decision, we have explosions like we've had at Girls' Eye. We've had explosions like you've had at San Souci. And come I tell you, there are countless others that I'm aware of that simply do not make it into the media. But what is our role? Because, and Dylan, I'm sorry to do this to you, but Dylan made this profound point this morning. He was saying that all of those kids that come out of the school, in a sense, emerge with a deficit when they come out. Even if they get 10 A's, and even if they do become the best doctors that we want in the country, they come out with a deficit because they can't understand that we share the space. And it's like sharing your house, sharing your home. There's got to be, you've got to agree that you want to live there together. Because unless we find mechanisms for all of us to work together to address these critical issues that we confront, the kind of doomsday that's in the press at the moment will be nothing compared to what we'll face then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Granville. I think that was such an exceptional scene setter that although we're sort of running behind in time, I'd like to give people an opportunity to make comments, observations, and one round of questions. I saw a hand go up there, one. Oh, actually, they're all shooting up. Granville, you've outdone yourself this morning. Okay, can I start? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So would you like to start, please?
So many. Okay. Thank you very much. Lots of information, lots of ideas to work with. I think it's always very important to think, well, what are the right questions to ask in a certain situation? So when you ask, well, what are they doing at universities in terms of alternative behavior management, exactly. I mean, if that's what you want to, how you would like to call it, I also think that it's important to make some distinctions, for example, between discipline and punishment, and perhaps it's asking the wrong questions, because I think for me what's really important to research is how different pedagogies, different ways of teaching and learning can prevent the problems in the first place. Which brings me to a much earlier remark you made about corporal punishment, and to what extent people support that because it didn't do anything wrong for them, right? It worked for them, which what we call in philosophy is a natural fallacy. So just because people do something and because it works, like history tells us such and such, therefore, I mean, we miss an argument there which makes it morally right, yeah? So I think, which again then links to your point about LO and life skills. I mean, when you now go into schools, life skills in the foundation phase is actually not being taught at all. And why? Because of the testing system. So what is the knowledge that's being tested? And what's the concern about for the government? So I think when we avoid making important distinctions, asking good questions and teaching reasoning skills, then we are actually perpetuating an educational system that doesn't think and doesn't ask the right questions at all levels. So I think for me, the most important question is, what are the questions we need to ask ourselves?
Thank you. Could you pass it on to Taryn, please?
Thank you so much for your discussion. I've got 2 questions, but they're not criticisms. They're just things that I think were flagged as questions. So when you talk about social cohesion in government, how often do you ask about inequality and structure? Because I think that that's a very important part of social cohesion that is missing from the conversation at the moment. Because when you make the example of xenophobia, for example, xenophobia is a language of discrimination, but it's deeply couched as a proxy for inequality in society, and it's historical. So it's not necessarily that it's just about people not getting along because they're not from the same country. It's about inequalities that exist that perpetuate themselves in such a way that the most vulnerable people in society don't feel as though they have a claim to what they feel is theirs. It's very basic explanation, but anyway, I can talk to you about it afterwards. And then the other thing is about the way that poor schools are being pathologized and how we're not throwing the conversation back at ex-Model C schools and the way that they perpetuate violence and the way that they're also corrupt. So, I mean, I had an interview with one teacher who taught in KZN, and he was saying that he worked at a school that he left because the school was wealthy enough to cover the extent of its corrupt practices, including kickbacks to staff and teachers, outside of the provisions of SASA in terms of what extra things you can give to teachers outside of their salaries. And it brings to the point that she made about universities, because obviously basic education can't take on all the responsibilities that higher education has. But I was talking to a friend last night who said to me that at present count, UCT has had at least 5 suicides of black undergraduate students. And that might not necessarily be the responsibility of basic education, but regardless of which schools these learners come from, they enter a tertiary education system that perpetuates this kind of violence towards them. And I mean, I teach students who themselves come to me with severe depression, severe alienation in the spaces they encounter that comes from the schools they came from at first. So whether they go to a township school or an ex-Model C school, they still enter tertiary education with the same sense of dis-ease. And I think that that's something that maybe we should also keep in mind.
Thanks, Taryn. Taryn, could you just go over here? There were some hands up this side. Oh, was that this way? Just, okay. Can we just keep it very short and choose the one very important issue you want to raise? Otherwise, we're not going to be cutting into tea time. We're probably eating into lunch, which might or might not be a good thing.
We do have a longer discussion session later today.
Right. Noted. Enver Hassan. I'm from the Western Cape Education Department. I'm based at Metro Central Education District Office. And I'm head of learner support. So CAN support is one of my portfolios. So Doc, I agree, I think, mostly with what you've said. I'd have liked you to have touched on some other issues aside from xenophobia that impact on schooling and social cohesion, such as the rate of sexual abuse and violence in our schools, particularly in the Western Cape, gang violence, which impacts very severely on issues of social cohesion. And then we tend to look, when we do look internationally at best practice, I think we need to look in Africa. You know, I recently had a discussion with African principals around what they do because they outperform us in the tests you're talking about. And I think there's much to be learned from engaging with them. I have other points, but I'll save them for later.
Thank you. Right, so we got a hand right at the back. I'll come back to you. I think if you could go, because now we've sort of we're running into extra time now. So
just with regard to your remark on the life orientation not being taught, in the primary school curriculum for the B.Ed, there's the Mr. Tech, you know, the minimum requirements, and in that, life skills is a compulsory for all students in the B.Ed program. So it's part of the curriculum. So it is taught because social, what is it, personal and social well-being is part of the life skills subject. So it is part of the B.Ed curriculum for primary school teachers.
thank you. I saw a hand over there, and I'll come back to you with the
Hi.
yeah.
Okay. I'm Zainab from LBC. Well, I brought up a couple of points regarding the disconnect between the DBE and tertiary institutes, which I will talk to you about later. But no, in regards to the importance of social cohesion, so I've ever thought about a value-added curriculum. I know we've had a lot of changes with our curriculum. So it's not necessarily we're going to change the curriculum, it's just a matter of expanding the curriculum by adding value to whatever, all our curricula. So that's something I think you should have your reflections on.
Thank you. Can I ask you to make your comment, and then the lady at the back? So just pass the mic back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was supposed to be number 4, but
Uh, anyway, Prof. Imenda, retired recently. I've got kind of a mixed identity at the moment because I now work for the National Teachers Union, NATU, conducted research recently for them on the priorities for CPTD that Dr. Whittle was talking about. Now, the issue of social cohesion, I think my other constraint is that I'm originally a science person by training. So I find the whole field of social justice quite distant from my own training. But what I see is that, and here, it looks like it is such a multidimensional issue that I'm not quite sure which angle we are taking, because from the examples that have been given of SGBs, teachers having policies in their schools that do not accommodate certain types of people, it looks to me as if social cohesion itself within the schooling system has these dimensions of learner to learner, teacher to teacher. If there are some schools that are still finding it very difficult to admit other races, and then you also have teacher to learner. And all these are dimensions that, so when we frame the issue, I'm not quite sure myself which one we are dealing with. But the point I wanted to make was, if grade 6 teachers are not able to answer grade 6 questions, that is not a university problem. Well, the impression was given that universities are not training teachers appropriately. But I think that if grade 6 teachers are not able to answer the questions that are based at that level, I think the problem with the schooling system. And the DBE itself must, I think, admit that the schooling system itself, universities cannot go and repeat grade 6 stuff when they are training teachers.
Thank you. The lady in the black hat, if you want to make your observations and comment, and then you'll be the last.
Very quick question. Lynn Herman from NAPTOSA. Is that just finding out from the department, are you revisiting the life orientation curriculum? If not, I think it should be reviewed, and chatting to teachers. The current curriculum lacks progression. There's a lot of repetition in the current curriculum, and the children are getting bored. So I've also engaged with that curriculum, and it doesn't speak enough to social